Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Great to see you all out here today. I'm glad it wasn't pouring down like it was this morning when I was out getting compost out of my compost pile. I'm thinking to myself, what is wrong with this picture? Anyway, I'm Cynthia Rabinowitz from Northwest Conservation District. And with me is Annette Lott and Kelsey Sudol. We all work at the Northwest Conservation District, and our office is in Torrington, Connecticut, obviously. And just a very quick introduction to what the Conservation District is, in case it's a new idea for some of you. We are part of a system, a nationwide system of soil and water conservation districts. In Connecticut, there are 5 districts. We have 34 towns in the northwest corner, and that includes towns all of Litchfield County, 1 town in Hartford County, 1 in New Haven County, and several in Fairfield County. So it's a very diverse district and includes both urban, rural, suburban areas. And there are a lot of things that we work on in all of those types of geographical areas. We work very closely with the 34 municipal governments, specifically the land use offices, the Inland Wetlands Conservation Commission, and a little bit with, the zoning, and not so much with zoning, but occasionally. Mostly the soil and water, wetlands and conservation issues. Public Works also a little bit. And we work with farms. Annette is our agricultural technician, and she works very closely on our behalf with the USDA NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And Kelsey is our biologist specializing in aquatic biology, so lakes and rivers and watersheds, and a soil scientist and horticulturist. So that's what we also have 2 other staff members. They're not here today, but we try to cover every aspect of conservation. We're a small staff, and we like to try to accomplish as much as we possibly can for just 5 people. Okay, so today we are going to talk about backyard composting, as you know. And let's dive right into it. I'm going to take the first part of the presentation and then turn it over to Annette. And then at the end, we'll take questions. I think it'd be better if, well, why don't we say that we'll have a few minutes for questions in the middle when we switch, and then again at the end. If you want to hold your questions to the end, that's fine too. So, first of all, why compost? Why do we want to make compost? Any suggestions from the floor? Better soil? Yep, keeps compostable, decomposable material out of the waste stream. Yeah, okay, all of those good things. We're going to look first at some information about the soil. So the soil food web is a system that is going on under our feet in the soil all the time, and we don't think about it. We can't see it really, because the organisms, for the most part, except obviously the larger animals over here. But the very important part of the soil food web is microscopic. And it starts over here with plants photosynthesizing, catching the rays of the sun, converting that through photosynthesis into carbohydrates, basically glucose, which gives the plants their energy. Also gives the microorganisms in the soil their energy, bacteria, fungi, other first trophic levels, a trophic level is essentially a level in the food chain. So humans and other large mammals are at the very top of the food chain. Bacteria are at the bottom of the food chain. So here we can see we're showing 5 trophic levels in this diagram, all connected to the life in the soil. And it's that life in the soil that we want to promote and keep healthy. We don't keep it healthy when we till it and dig a lot. We don't keep it healthy when we drive over it or when we pave it. Obviously, all those kinds of things will damage the system. Resilience, it's a resilient system, but it's also delicate. And so that is what we're thinking about when we're talking about compost. Some of the benefits of compost are that it helps to keep and maintain the soil structure in a healthy condition. So soil is composed of mineral particles and organic matter that is held together in aggregates. And those aggregates have pore spaces between the individual particles and between the aggregates. And those pore spaces allow air and water to move in a healthy way through the soil. A soil that is compacted has lost its structure. Compost helps the soil stay aggregated and maintain its structure. The author of this book, The Intelligent Gardener, points out that compost is not so much a way of adding nutrients to the soil, although that does happen as well, but not to the extent that we think. It's not totally replacing the need for other nutrients to be added to the soil. We should be thinking of compost as adding to the physical nature of the soil, that aggregation. And one of the reasons why that is important as well, as apart from the movement of air and water through the soil, it also helps what we call total cation exchange capacity. So this is a little bit of a technical thing. Cations are nutrients or elements that have a positive charge. So calcium, magnesium, for example, are 2 very, potassium also, are elements that have positive charges. In order for a soil to be fertile and have the ability to hold on to those elements that plants need, and there are a lot of macronutrients, those are essential plant nutrients, of which calcium, potassium, and magnesium are just 3. There's a whole list of them. There are also micronutrients like boron, for example, which are used only, they're called trace elements. But these nutrients have to be kept in like a reservoir in the soil. So unless you have a healthy soil that can hold on to those nutrients, they will just get washed out of the soil with rain. They'll leach out and not be available for plant growth. So this is really a good way of understanding what we're doing when we're putting compost into the soil. The total cation exchange capacity is the ability of the soil to hold on to and release the nutrients to the roots of the plants. And the way they do this is with the minute mineral particles, specifically clay particles, and also organic matter. So the organic matter in a soil comes from broken down plant material. And that happens in nature, in the woods, or any natural setting where plants are growing, leaves are falling, root hairs are sloughing off, branches fall, twigs fall. Eventually that all breaks down into the soil and adds organic matter to the soil. The clay, that's a different story, and we're not really here to talk that much about it, but I will say that in the northwest corner here, we don't have a lot of clay in our soils, but we do have sufficient, because most of our soils are loamy soils, loamy sands of one type or another, and the term loam implies that there's clay there. So in order to have a good cation exchange capacity, we have to have these microscopic particles in the soil, the clay and the broken down organic matter or filaments that we find in compost. Okay, if there are any questions about this, we can come back to it later. Oh, here's a slide. I forgot to go on to this. So just a little diagram showing you a rather cartoonish root. So this is labeled a root hair, but root hairs are actually hairs. They're like the diameter of your hair. They're very tiny, and so those root hairs are interacting with the surface of a clay particle or the surface of compost, and exchanging nutrients from the plant, the glucose, for the macro and micro elements that are held onto the plant roots. So hot composting is really the best way to do composting, but it's very difficult for the homeowner to do hot composting. Why? Because it's very difficult to get the heat up in a home compost pile, because you have to have more precise ratios of your ingredients. You need to be building a pile of a certain size right from the beginning. You need to tend it more often and turn it on a regular basis. And even it's helpful to use a soil thermometer. It's like a meat thermometer, only it has a long, a long spike that you can stick into the center of your pile, and turn it when the temperature in the middle of your pile reaches a certain degree level. And that's really not easy for the home gardener to do. And I don't make hot compost. I try to, but life gets in the way, and you miss an opportunity to turn it. It's just not really convenient, but it is good to know about, because making hot compost kills weed seeds and helps to kill off pest organisms that might, fungal diseases, for example, that might get into your compost. So cold composting is what most of us make, unless you're a professional composter or you have a farm or you're very, very interested in making hot compost and you make it part of your life. Cold composting is more popular because less effort is required. You can add to your pile as you accumulate your material. It's easier to manage because you don't need that precision. It's less labor intensive, and the ratio of your brown material to your green material, which we'll talk about in a minute, is easier to achieve. And it also doesn't lead to nitrogen or carbon loss, which actually hot compost does, because the heat can drive off those elements. Nitrogen is very volatile. It can become gaseous, and that's one of the disadvantages of hot compost. Vermicompost uses these red wiggler worms to recycle your organic matter. And there are other species, but the red wigglers are the most common type that people use. You have to order them. They're not native in our area. They don't survive the winter here. So if you're going to do it outdoors, you need to either sacrifice your worms over the winter and get a new starter pack the following spring, or bring your worms inside. And we'll get to that later on. So as you can see here, there are some disadvantages. It can be stinky if it's not done right. And if you do it in your house, which is what I've done, and I believe you do, right, Annette? And I have made vermicompost, but I find that I could not overcome the plague of fungus gnats that get into the compost, and they cloud around your house and get into your houseplants, and I didn't like that. It was difficult. So maybe my management wasn't the greatest, and I plan on trying it again at some point. But it is a good way to use up your kitchen scraps during the winter if you have difficulty managing a pile outside. Moisture levels have to be kept just right, because if the food scraps and the bedding that you put in gets too wet, it's not conducive to a good healthy system. On the plus side, though, it is something that you can do indoors. It's really fun if you have young children in your family, and it's a great way to educate them. Leaf mold is not technically a compost, and the reason it's not a compost is because it's a single ingredient. I actually brought some. I guess now's as good a time as any. I don't know if you can see it. This was taken from the inside of a pile of leaves that's about this high. And I'll just bring some out. I don't know what's so funny about this. So you can see this is not broken down to the final stage of decomposition, but it's on its way. This was from the interior of the pile, and you can still see the shape of the leaves, and you can recognize that they're leaves. But, you know, as time goes on, now that we're into warmer weather, the leaf pile will start to decompose more quickly, and we will eventually end up with something that resembles compost. And it's very useful material for replenishing the organic matter in soil. It's great for using as mulch and a variety of things like that. You can use it partially decomposed like this, which I do, as mulch. If it's more decomposed, you can use it as you would a compost. And sometimes if you're not going to turn your leaf pile, it will take up to 2 years sometimes to get really finished leaf mold. But you don't have to wait for it to be completely finished. Okay. So okay, so I'll just go for another couple of slides here. Ingredients and maintenance of your pile. So the more different ingredients you have, the better your compost will be. It will have a wider array of nutrients, and also the different types of ingredients will have different shapes and sizes. The smaller material that you put in will break down quicker. It's better if you can shred things up as much as you can. That's not always possible, but you know, you can try, because it will help speed up the composting process. But let's face it, any pile of organic matter left on the ground eventually will become compost, whether you do anything to it or not. The only thing about that is that if you have a pile of material sitting on the ground and you do nothing with it, you don't turn it or try to aerate it at all, you might end up with a rather stinky compost pile. So turning or aerating your pile is definitely recommended. It's also important to pay attention to the ratio of what we call brown material and green material. So we do have a slide on that right here. So the brown material adds more of the carbon into the compost, and the green material is adding more nitrogen. So the brown materials, as you can see on the left-hand side, are more dry kinds of things. And Actually, I didn't bring any raw brown material except for leaves. But any of these kinds of things, used paper coffee filters, tea bags, but you do have to watch out. If your tea bags don't break down, that's probably because they're not natural materials. I've noticed that some tea companies are using like a nylon material. That's not good for our composting, but whatever this is, I believe it's a paper because it does break down. The other thing would be coffee filters and with the coffee grounds in. Paper towels, shredded paper. I actually do use a lot of shredded paper in my, did I? I'm sorry. Trying to keep my hands, okay. But then, okay, so wood chips, if they're small, wood shavings, cardboard, anything like that can be your part of your brown dry material. Green material is what we routinely would gather from our kitchens. And it also would include grass clippings, green grass clippings, not grass clippings that have been lying around basically turning into hay, which is dry, so then it would be part of the brown material. But if you have a lawnmower that has a bag that collects the clippings, that would be great green material to use in your compost pile. Any of these other things. Now, this list includes meats, bones, seafood, etc. We don't really advise you to use that kind of ingredient in your home compost pile because you're probably making a cold compost pile and it's probably not going to be big enough to really get the heat up and break down those kinds of food products, unfortunately. So just bear that in mind. Otherwise, most food material, eggshells are fine. They do actually take a long time to break down. It's best if you crush them. When you go to use your compost, you'll probably find some little recognizable pieces of eggshell. It's not a problem. Just use it in the garden. It'll continue to break down and add calcium to your soil. So we need to keep the ratio of the browns and greens in a good synchronization. So an easy way to think of it is to, you'll find all different formulas are recommended. Sometimes you'll see 1/3 green to 2/3 brown, but 50-50 is okay as well. What's important is you want to have a balance.
All right, hello, my name's Annette again. Cynthia mentioned I'm the ag tech with the district. I'm also a small farmer for about 3 years. And I'll say I've been composting pretty much my whole life, but not with all the knowledge I have now. So I'll say you can approach it in a very loosey-goosey way, and we'll get through that as we talk about the different ways you can approach it. And it can be really achievable if any of this is at all intimidating. So for your hot compost start, a good mix, a good rule is like 1/3 green, 2/3 brown. Again, brown is dry, green is like living and wet. We sort of covered some of these topics before. A method I've done before and I can say works well is a good way to try and get these measurements actually in your pile is to use a bunch of buckets. You don't even need 20 buckets at once. You can just measure out with the buckets, like a standard 5-gallon bucket that we have up here. I'll say one thing we haven't discussed is the difference between like high nitrogen and low, green is high nitrogen, but you have certain ingredients that are particularly high in nitrogen, like your animal manures, certain, I think like hops, their waste is particularly high, but what people tend to have access to is like animal manure, not so much your pet manure, more so livestock. If you have a local farm, they might have some available. But anyway, so you want some high nitrogen material. If you don't have access to that, you could just do like 9 or 10 buckets of like the normal green materials. and then the rest will be your brown carbon-rich materials. You can soak them before adding them to your pile, or you can, as you're mixing, add water in. And then here, I think next is, yeah, so here's a picture of some people using this method. And you can see in the back, this sort of fencing material. You can do it with hardware cloth as well, made in a cylinder that you can pour your buckets into. So they chose to layer it as they went. I've chosen to mix it before I go. It's whatever floats your boat. It doesn't make a huge difference. I like mixing just because I like feeling that all the ingredients are evenly distributed, whereas this will eventually decompose and things will distribute. But this material here is important to note as well. The fencing, it allows that aeration component a bit easier than let's say a hard-walled compost bin, which doesn't have that same amount of airflow. But that doesn't mean you don't have to turn this if you really want to get it going fast. You're still going to want to be turning it. And you're also going to be wanting to check the temperature. So this is for if you were approaching a hot compost scenario. And like Cynthia said, these things are very long, so you can stick it directly into the middle of your pile and get a reading. Okay. So if you're going for a hot compost, paying attention to the temperature as it gets going. Once it gets to 130 to 150 F, you want to be turning it like every 3 days. If it's increasing during that, you want to increase it to every 2 days. If it increases to 161 to 170, you want to be turning it, 1 day after it hits that temp. And then if it's 170 degrees or more, like your compost is very hot, and you need to be turning it till it comes back down to a suitable temp. So this is why we say hot compost if you're trying to do it properly, so to speak. I don't think there's a wrong way to compost, but we'll say properly. Can be really intensive. You're having to check the temperature every couple days. You're having to turn it when you do. When you turn it, you got to be a little methodical about how you do it. You separate it into thirds, so to say, and the middle is going to be the most composted because it will have been the hottest, insulated on the top and the bottom and the sides. So you try and take the top off, take the middle out, move the bottom, put the top, or you're trying to distribute the top to the outsides, and then the middle to the outsides and the top to the inside. It's a little bit more methodical of a turning than some of the other methods you could use. Again, you can get a hot compost not being as methodical, but it's more difficult, and you're not guaranteed to actually get that. So going back to cold composting, which is maybe a bit more approachable, you can really go more with a 50-50 mix here. It's a bit more flexible because you're playing with time a bit more. It's going to take a bit longer. To encourage, again, that aeration that we said is really important. If you have branches or materials or wood pallet at the bottom of your pile, that's a great way to start. Then you're going to layer your different materials roughly. I'll say you don't have to, again, but in ideal cold composting, you want to layer them, keep it moist as you're going. Avoid putting weed seeds. Again, we've said the hot composting's a great benefit of it is that it kills pests and pathogens and weed seeds. Your cold compost is not going to do that. So if you're putting any weeds from your yard or your garden that you're pulling in and they have seeds, you're going to have compost that will give you more weeds. Alternative, you could cut the seeds off, I guess, is another option, and dispose of them separately if you want to still use that material. But you can layer the material, or again, mix it as you go. Just try and make sure it's evenly mixed. And then as you're checking on it occasionally, not daily, like your hot compost, make sure you're checking for moisture. If it's too dry, it's not going to be decomposing as well as it could be. So you have many options for a cold pile. You could just do a pile in the most literal sense in your yard. You could fortify it, some from bears or other interested critters, perhaps. There's sort of 3 bin systems where this makes it a bit easier when you're turning it. If you choose to turn it, you can just go from one into the other, and it's a popular system. But again, with this system, you see there's maybe not as much airflow, so that is why turning it might be a bit more important. You can even do it with this, so you are getting that airflow. Again, the caveats, it's just taking longer and it's not killing the things you want it to kill. So when you are thinking about aerating, there's options. You can physically turn it, like we've been saying, with a shovel, or they sell these nice little tools that you sort of go like this and it spins and lifts things up. You could stick PVC pipes that you've drilled holes to into the center of your pile, just to encourage that airflow. I've also seen you can like just poke holes into the pile, like you're not leaving a pipe there, but you can, it depends on if it's holding up or not, but that's another thing. And the other thing you want to check is your moisture content. We keep saying that the moisture is important. You want it wet, not too dry. So 40 to 60%, but what does that look like? It's when you take a sample of your compost and you hold it in your hand, if it's dripping already before you squeeze it, you're at 100% moisture. It's probably very smelly, or it just rained and it's too wet. You're going to want it to dry out. You can add in some dry materials. They'll absorb some of that moisture. You probably maybe also want to tarp it to prevent rain from coming in. And you might need to start over. If it's too far gone, it hasn't rained, it's just too high in nitrogen and it's very wet, it will just be a high nitrogen source for your next pile. It's not a lost cause, but it's not going to do it on its own unless you add more stuff to it. So 60 to 70% saturation if you squeeze it and you're able to get some moisture drops out, and then 40 to 50% saturation if you can feel it's moist, but it's not dripping. It should feel a little warm depending on if you're pulling from the middle of the pile, but a good, once it's been in your hand for a minute, you can tell something's moist when it feels cool to the touch, like your soil. I don't know if you have gardens and you go out and you stick your finger in, often it might feel cool if it is moist, if you can't tell. So just a couple quick notes. If you haven't composted before, you might see garden centers trying to sell you compost starters, enzymes. They're not bad. I would just argue they're not necessary and you don't need to spend the money. You can mix some soil from your existing space into, because it's going to have all that soil, food web, microorganism life that we just talked about, that's going to be doing your composting and helping out with that. They're already around. You can just steal some of them from the ground and you'll put them back later when you use your compost. But that's up to you. Another thing is that you might see these compost bins being sold. They're totally fine. I have 2 of these because our town was doing a recycling and trash, was subsidizing them. And so I said, well, I want to try those. They do work. They're a little small if you have perhaps a larger family or a large garden. So that's just the only thing I would say to consider with those. And you maybe have a little less control with like the getting it out can be annoying of this one, especially. That one, I think you could probably lift it. But it's a good option if you have a smaller space and you don't maybe want to be turning it with a shovel. You can just spin the bin and it does a good job. You might just fill it up faster than you'd like. I guess one more thing I didn't put a picture on here, but I did have come to my mind as another thing I've seen that it's being sold for a ridiculous price that I would not advise anybody get, is like an under the sink mechanical composter. It like dehydrates your food and then like blends it up, and it calls it compost and it uses energy to do so. And it's marketed towards like city folk who don't have a yard. And I wouldn't recommend that. I'd say go to the farmer's market, see if there's any farms that want to take your compost, or a neighbor, somebody. Makes no sense to me. They're very expensive and would not recommend those either. But anyways, so once you've made your compost, however you make it, I'll say I didn't really explain the least effort methods, which is just to leave it in the pile to do as it does, and it will eventually decompose. Eventually you'll get finished compost, which is dark, it smells earthy, it looks kind of like you would want your garden soil to look like because it's dark and rich in that organic matter. Is your compost? Yeah. Cynthia had brought some of her quite finished compost. Yeah, get a whiff. Your compost should not smell bad. Your compost piles should not smell bad if you're paying attention to your ratios. So now you have this wonderful resource, and we're going to talk about, oh, likewise, it has a wealth of fungi, which are like long spaghettis, and bacteria, which can look more like beads or strings of beads. We want these things. We want a bit more fungi than bacteria generally, but it's going to be teeming with life, and you're going to want to use it. So it's easily put. You can put it in your garden beds, like to fill them with 1 to 2 inches or 1 to 3 inches. It can be a top dress in between harvests. Like if you have lettuce that's bolting and you're going to pull it out and put something new in, go ahead and put more compost down. It can be used in the transplant holes. Like we had said at the beginning about the cations and all the good stuff it does for the soil. When you're putting this in when you're planting your plants, they're going to appreciate it. You're going to get healthier plants that are going to be a little bit more resistant to diseases, assuming everything else is going well as well. You can add it as sort of a mulch. So I'd say the difference to me in my mind from a top dress or like adding it into your garden beds, maybe mixing it in more so, and a mulch is the intent. So like a mulch which another point to mention is a mulch is a great option for compost that maybe isn't as finished. It still has larger materials that haven't broken down yet, because it acts as a protective layer over your soil, which if we haven't explained, the soil kind of likes to stay covered because of the soil food web and everything it's doing. When it's exposed to the sun and moisture is removed from the top inch or two, that food web isn't going to be active. So if you keep your soil covered, you're reducing evaporation, you're mediating the temperatures in the soil, and some will feed, the biology will feed down a little bit as well. You can also start seedlings with it, add in some loam, some sand. You can look up different seed mixes depending on what you're trying to start, like what sort of mix they might want. But it's again, not really, I'm saying garden beds here, it can be landscaping as well. Any plants you have around your house, they're never going to be mad at you putting compost around them. I think, unless there was anything else we wanted to mention, we're at a point where we can take general questions.
To add something,
go ahead.
To me just now, we talked about using the leaf mold and the compost as mulch, and Annette just mentioned that that can be around your landscape plants as well as so trees and shrubs. But I do want to caution you. You may see where mulching has been done up against established trees and shrubs, or even newly planted ones, piled up against the lower part of the trunk. You don't want to do that. You want to keep the mulch away from the trunk,
like a donut around the tree.
Because otherwise, if you pile any kind of mulch, wood chips will start to, they're aerated in the beginning, but they get wet and they start decomposing, and it's too wet against the bark. So you want to stay away from that, but certainly over the roots, but only not thickware, really. You don't need to spread compost very thickly unless you are trying to rejuvenate a very poor soil situation, in which case then maybe you would use more and perhaps dig it in. But if you're just simply using it as a top dressing, really 2 to 3 inches is really all you need for a soil that's already been improved in the past. Just to, okay.
And this is, an introduction. There's a lot more you can do with compost, but we didn't want to overwhelm people. But if you have questions about anything else you've heard, feel free to bring it up.
Oh, did you want to show?
Oh, I do. Yes, sorry. We didn't cover how to vermicompost, I guess. There's a lot in that. And we were just trying to focus on the standard.
Today's.
But this is from my vermicomposting. It's quite dark and wet because I did not do a great job, but it still works. And what happened is we did a program with kids, and we have a big compost pile. So this had not been my priority to keep up, but it's still producing a fantastic compost. The only thing that we get, because it's particularly wet, is an abundance of springtails, which are little white bugs that are hiding because they don't like the sun. They're used to my bin, which is completely dark. And so this is, I have literally a Rubbermaid bin in my like garage room, like where we walk between the garage and the home. And I maybe opened it once a month and would put some scraps in, and they are still alive. They're not the happiest, and they would be doing better if I was tending to them more. But that's my point in just saying that, like, you get out of it what you give. You can have a really easy system. Maybe you'll get compost once a year that you feel like you can use, or you can really actively do it and be getting compost once a month. It's up to you. So I guess we can take questions now.